Hi class, this is Dr. McGonigal and this is video 2 for leadership. In our first video, we introduced leadership and defined it, and we talked about how there are different ways to understand leadership. And we ended off last time with the behavioral approach, and this time we're starting with contingency approaches. So contingency approaches move the focus away from just focusing on leader traits or behaviors, and focusing instead on both the leader's actions or behaviors and the situation. So the word contingent means it depends. And that might help you remember what the contingency approaches are. Basically saying that it depends not only on the leader's behaviors, but also the situation that the leader is in. So the model that we're going to talk about is called Fielder's contingency model. And Fielder said that there are two categories of leader behaviors. The first is task-oriented, and this corresponds with the behavior approach that we talked about previously in terms of initiating structure. So if you remember from last time, the Ohio State and University of Michigan studies said that there are two categories of leader behaviors: initiating structure and consideration. And the contingency approach is similar to that because the contingency approach has task-oriented and relationship-oriented. So task-oriented is similar to initiating structure, and relationship-oriented is similar to consideration. And so Fielder also said that it's not just about the behaviors. Like I said, it's about also the situation. And so Fielder came up with different characteristics of the situation. And these concluded the quality of the leader-member relations, or the relationship between leaders and their followers. So is it overall cooperative? Is there teamwork? Or are they combative? Next is the degree of task structure. So does the task itself involve a lot of structure in terms of, is there a clear correct and incorrect way to do the task, or is it more open-ended? And the third is the leader's position in the company. So do they have positional power within the organization? So this chart on slide 15 kind of summarizes Fielder's contingency model. And so if we look, just kind of skipping down to the bottom row that's bolded, we can see that the appropriate leadership style is either task-oriented or relationship-oriented, depending on the characteristics of the situation. So looking at the columns here, there is two situations or two combinations of circumstances in which task-oriented behaviors are more appropriate for leaders. And these are situations that may be considered unfavorable or very favorable for the leader. Let's take a look at the unfavorable first. So in an unfavorable situation, the leader-follower relations are poor. So people may not be cooperating, they may be antagonistic. The task structure is unstructured, meaning that there's not a lot of clear structure to the task. There's not a clear correct or incorrect way to do it. And the leader positional power is weak. So in that case, a task-oriented approach would be more appropriate. On the other hand, in a situation that's very favorable, the leader-follower relations are great. People are cooperating with one another. They have high levels of trust. The task structure is highly structured, and the leader's positional power is strong. So in that case, the task-oriented would also be appropriate. Now, any other combination of these three things, the leader-follower relations, the task structure, and the positional power, would lead to a relationship-oriented approach being most appropriate in those situations. Okay, so the next theory that we'll talk about is called leader-member exchange theory. And leader-member exchange theory is also sometimes abbreviated as LMX. And leader-member exchange theory is all about the relationship between leaders and their followers. This is a very popular theory in IO psychology. And it basically says that leaders end up having unique relationships between themselves and their subordinates or their followers. And sometimes those relationships are what we call high quality, when the leader and the follower trust each other, they mutually like each other, and they have professional respect for one another. And therefore, because there is that trust and that mutuality, they have an obligation, a felt obligation to support one another and to not disappoint one another. So typically in that situation, you have a high level of employee satisfaction. Employees tend to perform better in that situation, and they tend to want to stay with their organization and be motivated in their jobs. On the other hand, you also could have a low quality LMX relationship. And these are characterized by maybe some level of disliking, so low levels of liking, maybe low levels of loyalty, and respect might be lacking in that situation. So the employee in that case might feel an obligation to do their tasks for their job, but not necessarily in order to support the manager or their leader. They're just doing it because they have to, basically. So they're not going to go above and beyond. So trust is a really important component of leader-member exchange. And so if you have a high quality LMX relationship, that's definitely going to have high trust, and low quality will have low trust. And what helps create these situations of high quality LMX relationships? Well, the research shows that leaders tend to have trust in their subordinates when they feel that those subordinates are competent. So it's really important for subordinates early on in the relationship to demonstrate that they are competent, they can do their job well, that they are motivated, and that they have the knowledge and the skills and the motivation to perform well. And in that case, the leaders are more likely to have trust in the subordinates, and they might even place greater trust in them by giving them more assignments and then more opportunities for that high quality relationship to build. Slide 17 has a model of leader-member exchange theory, and kind of similar to how I've done it in other modules, I'll kind of walk through this, okay? So let's start with the consequences. So these are the ultimate outcomes that we're looking at, that we're looking to predict, and these are things like how much control somebody has on the job, their job satisfaction levels, their organizational commitment, so how committed they are to the organization. And we're going to talk about job satisfaction and organizational commitment more in the coming weeks. Turnover and career success. So all of these things are positive outcomes, possibly, of leader-member exchange. So next we move back and we see that this is leader-member exchange. So leader-member exchange predicts all of these important outcomes or consequences, these things that we just talked about. Now, what predicts leader-member exchange quality? Well, what I just talked about was how subordinates need to demonstrate their competence, right? And so that's the first thing that we have here in our antecedents list. So antecedent is a fancy word for predictor or something that can lead to something else. So if a supervisor perceives that their employee is competent, that will lead to higher levels of leader-member exchange and will lead to the employee having these positive outcomes. Another predictor is personality, perceived similarity. So I mentioned in a previous module that perceived similarity is important to liking, and this can come into play in terms of bias when there's interviews happening, for instance, or performance ratings happening, but it also comes to play in leader-member exchange theory. So if you are trying to build rapport with a supervisor, looking for those similarities between you and the supervisor, or likewise, if you're a supervisor and you're looking to build rapport with a subordinate, looking for those perceived similarities between the two of you, building on that. Leader behaviors are important to leader-member exchange as well. So leaders need to, have consideration and be respectful of their subordinates and be fair. And the final one is employee impression management. So it's important to try to show your best self when you're on the job. And so to the degree that the employee can do that and manage the impression that others are perceiving of them, they're going to have ultimately better leader-member exchange relationships with their supervisor and all of these more positive outcomes. All right, so moving on from LMX to talk about leadership in terms of different types of leadership. So there are three major categories of leadership, and the first is called transformational. This transformational leadership is one of the most studied areas of leadership in IO psychology. And we'll talk more about it in the coming slides, but just to give you an introduction, transformational leaders inspire their followers. They inspire them to go above and beyond their own interests to pursue goals and attain results. So they get their followers, transformational leaders get their followers to see kind of a bigger picture or a bigger goal in mind. And they get them to kind of abandon their own self-interests and work toward the greater good. There are four main components of transformational leadership that we'll talk about in just a moment. Transactional leadership, on the other hand, is oftentimes known as when leaders use carrots and sticks. So this is kind of an old-timey phrase. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I think what it comes from is, if you're trying to get a horse to do something, to motivate a horse to do something, you have like a carrot to like make the horse like go toward the carrot, or a stick to punish the horse. So, hopefully, no one's punishing horses with sticks that much anymore, but that's the idea. So carrots and sticks are rewards and punishments. So transactional leadership tends to be more focused on the tasks than the future orientation. And essentially, it's about controlling the employee by rewarding and punishing, and clearly telling the employee what they are supposed to do in order to get rewards and avoid punishments. And the third type is called laissez-faire. And this is a type of leadership when leaders don't take responsibility for their actions. They are oftentimes like unavailable to followers, and they avoid making decisions. It's almost like non-leadership. Laissez-faire leadership is sometimes included under transactional leadership, and I believe that's the way it's included in your textbook. Like I said, transformational leaders are leaders with considerable and unusual influence. And so now we're going to spend some time just talking more about transformational leadership and what that looks like. Transformational leadership is said to allow a leader to transform their followers. How do they transform them? They make them believe in themselves, in their abilities to do something. They inspire passion in their followers, and they motivate them. They generate confidence and self-efficacy, and they elevate people's self-expectations. So they help people feel that they can do things, basically, and that they should do things. Transformational leadership is oftentimes considered to be a very positive form of leadership in organizations because in general, it positively relates to employee job performance. So people who have transformational leaders tend to perform better. They tend to be more satisfied with their jobs. They tend to have more commitment to want to stay with their organizations. And they also have higher levels of OCB. So OCB is an abbreviation for organizational citizenship behaviors. These are also called contextual performance, and we went over these, I think, in the criterion chapter. So these are types of behaviors that go above and beyond your task performance or what you need to do as part of your job description to enhance the quality of the working environment. So, for example, like bringing in a cake on someone's birthday or organizing a social gathering. All right, so can you think of any transformational leaders? And I do want to show you a video to help illustrate an example of transformational leadership. But before I show you the video, I want to move on to show you the actual components of transformational leadership on slide 20 here. So there are four main components to transformational leadership. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 here. The first is called idealized influence, and this is also sometimes called charisma. If you know what I'm talking about with charisma, you know it when you see it, but it's kind of hard to define. It's hard to put words to it. Someone who is charismatic is able to kind of appeal to the emotions of individuals and gets them to follow him or her because of that emotional appeal. In terms of idealized influence, you can also think about it as role modeling. And in terms of idealized influence, again, we can think of it as the person or the leader's stated beliefs and values aligning with their actions. So really living out their actions and being a role model for their followers. The next piece of transformational leadership is inspirational motivation. And this is how leaders provide meaning and challenge to their employees. They help them envision a future and communicate expectations. So they help their workers kind of see the bigger picture and know what the company is working toward. And they see what the future is going to look like in that organization. And they get people on board with it and communicate that effectively. The next piece is called intellectual stimulation. And this is that a leader allows their followers to question their assumptions and see old problems in new ways. So a transformational leader will make people question the status quo and say, maybe we need to do things a little bit differently. Maybe we need a new approach here. Individualized consideration is the last component. And in that, the leaders pay attention to individuals' needs and act as a mentor or a coach for individual workers. So for individualized consideration, if you've ever had a leader, a supervisor, or even someone that's a leader in another organization, like a school group or something like that, who really takes the time to reach out to you and get to know you and maybe even asks what your career aspirations are and helps you kind of think through that. That's what we mean by individualized consideration. By doing that, a leader is able to stimulate in their follower a desire to work harder so that that leader can succeed. Okay, so moving on from transformational leadership to transactional leadership. And there are different subtypes of transactional leadership. So remember, transactional leadership is about kind of telling employees what to do and rewarding or punishing them accordingly. So it's less about inspiring people and motivating people based on emotion and inspiration and personal relationships, and it's more about focusing on the task at hand. So the first type or subtype of transactional leadership is called contingent reward. And this is when a leader conveys their expectations to the employee, and they also convey what needs to be done to obtain valued rewards within the organization. Active management by exception is the type of transactional leadership where managers search out employee mistakes and punish employees for those mistakes. So I think that will become a little bit clearer once I explain passive management by exception. So passive management by exception is also focused on punishments, but only when issues arise. So passive management by exception is when leaders don't really kind of keep an eye out for problems, but when they do arise, they then punish their employees accordingly. So both active management by exception and passive management by exception are focused on punishments, But the active is when the manager looks out for them. The passive is when they wait for problems to come up. And then I mentioned before laissez-faire leadership. Sometimes this is in its own category. Sometimes it's put underneath transactional leadership. But in any case, it is referring to leaders who do not take responsibility, who are often unavailable to their followers, and who avoid making what we call executive decisions, which are basically decisions about how to act. And so out of these four, which one would you prefer if you were an employee? Would you want contingent reward, or would you want some kind of management by exception or laissez-faire? Well, obviously this will depend on the person, but most people would say contingent reward because this is focused on rewards, and it means that managers are clearly conveying their expectations and telling their employees what they need to do. Okay, so transformational and contingent reward, like I said, tend to be seen as most effective and lead to better satisfaction by the followers. Management by exception, both passive and active, and also laissez-faire tend to be seen as less effective and lead to lower levels of follower satisfaction. There are other types of leadership as well. So the first is authentic leadership. And this is referring to leaders who have good self-awareness, and they are definitely honest and sincere, have a strong sense of what's right and wrong, and they act accordingly. So they portray an authenticity. They show the world who they are, and they kind of own that, and they, through that authenticity, they are able to inspire their followers that way. Ethical leadership is focused on leaders who emphasize ethical behaviors, so behaving in according to ethical guidelines and adhering to morally upstanding values. So ethical leaders very clearly say what they believe in their organization believes is ethical and moral, and they stick to those values. They uphold those values. And this is especially important in the wake of corporate scandals. Abusive supervision is when supervisors sustain displays of hostile and demeaning behaviors. This doesn't include physical contact, so hopefully that wouldn't occur in an organization, but it does include things like ridiculing employees, reminding people of their personal failures or mistakes, being rude, invading employees' privacy, being disrespectful, speaking to an employee in negative language. All of these are examples of abusive supervision. And abuse kind of indicates that it's not just a one-time occurrence. So typically abusive supervision goes on for a sustained amount of time. Abusive supervision is extremely negative. It affects followers significantly. It can cause distress. It can cause anxiety in followers. It can cause depression. It's also illegal if it's discriminatory. So if someone is being abusive toward a subordinate and it's on the basis of a protected characteristic, then that is illegal discrimination. But in any case, it's bad practice. Supervisors should not be engaging in these activities under any circumstance. We're going to end this video talking about leadership development. So leadership development is referring to a broad array of activities that focus on developing skills of leaders. So helping leaders, for instance, be more transformational. So helping them be better in terms of intellectual stimulation, individualized consideration, helping them be better at telling their employees what they want them to do, and helping them see what they need to do in order to obtain rewards. So, for example, a lot of times leadership coaching is used. Coaching is a one-on-one process where a leader meets with an executive coach, and oftentimes it starts with 360-degree feedback. So we talked about 360-degree feedback in our performance appraisal session. But 360-degree feedback is when you pull information from a lot of different sources. So from the employee, the leader, him or herself, from their subordinates, from their colleagues, from higher level managers, and all of this information gets given back to the manager who's being coached. So the coach can help the manager interpret the feedback. The coach can help the manager come up with goals and ways to move forward so that they can address some of the points where their feedback is. So that is oftentimes used, the 360-degree feedback along with the coaching. Mentoring is another category of leadership development. Mentoring is slightly different from coaching because mentoring is typically from a person who's in the same organization as the leader who's undergoing mentoring, whereas a coach oftentimes is external to the organization. So mentors are typically in the same company. They maybe aren't in the same company, but they are typically not paid, whereas coaches are typically paid. So it's a more formal employment relationship with a coach. With a mentor, oftentimes it's less formal, and it could just be anything from a friendship in the workplace where someone's giving another person advice to a more formal mentor relationship where the organization identifies a specific mentor for that leader and they meet on a regular basis. And the goal of mentoring is to teach managers the norms of the workplace. So what are the typical behaviors of people in that workplace? What is the normal way to act? And to provide assistance with problems and challenges. So the idea is that the leader needs someone to go to if they're having issues, and the mentor can be a great person for that. And then finally, developmental assignments. So this is when managers are placed in positions where they acquire skills and knowledge that they will need in a higher level managerial role. So these are kind of stretch assignments where they kind of get out of their comfort zone, and they could include, for example, going overseas and serving as an expatriate. An expatriate is a fancy word for employees in the United States who get placed in other countries for a set amount of time. Or perhaps even managing a different team. So these types of assignments can help managers build their skill sets.